Good morning again. Thank you all so much for being here today. Special welcome to those of you who are visiting us for the first time. Thank you so much for giving us a try. I hope that you find in this community friendship and welcome and love and warmth. And we are just so blessed by your presence. Thank you, Tori, for sharing a wonderful reading from my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed. Without question, one of the finest, a great minister, but also one of the finest Unitarian Universalist historians, and very much a historian writing about the history of race and racism in Unitarian Universalism. Before I say a few words about the reading and a term that I feel describes where I both believe and hope Unitarian Universalism is heading in the future, let me just say a few words about what's going on in the Middle East. I know many of us, perhaps all of us, are troubled, feeling heaviness. I know I've been feeling it. And it's a difficult, if not impossible, set of circumstances. So much violence, so much innocent life lost. It's just another reminder, as I think I alluded to last week, how horrible it is when humankind resorts to violence and war to settle or to combat their disputes and their conflicts. My hope and my prayer is that somehow wisdom will prevail. I'm not very optimistic. I just want you to know, as I hope you can see right now as I'm stammering for words, that if you're struggling, I think we all are, and I'm certainly struggling. So I just will continue to pray for peace. Over the last year or so, Unitarian Universalists have been engaged in a really important conversation, discussion, at times a debate about our Unitarian Universalist principles. Now, for those of you who are brand new to us, Unitarian Universalism is a religion without a creed. So we don't have a core statement of faith or belief that you are required to hold in order to be part of this congregation, to be considered a Unitarian Universalist, and certainly not to be saved or to experience salvation. That's another sermon, but our historical roots say that everybody's automatically saved because God is a God of unconditional love. There I go, off on another tangent. Now, this conversation within Unitarian Universalism is about what's called Article 2 of our denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association's bylaws. And that's where our principles and purposes, principles that were developed democratically through lots of conversation some decades ago, that's where they live. Now, last Sunday, I shared the story of how the current principles emerged in the late 1970s and especially in the early 1980s, thanks to the courageous and visionary leadership of a group of Unitarian Universalist women who were determined to break down structures of patriarchy and marginalization that centered male leadership and gender-exclusive language. Their determination forever changed Unitarian Universalism, leading not only to our current principles, but also opening the doors of professional ministry to women and enriching our spiritual lives in ways that we today take for granted, including things like lighting a flaming chalice at the beginning of not just our worship services, but almost everything we do in Unitarian Universalism. And also, as you experienced a minute ago, holding space during worship for joys and sorrows. Now, as I look back on the impact of the women's movement on Unitarian Universalism, I am convinced that we UUs are at our best when we are questioning old assumptions, breaking down barriers that exclude rather than welcome, and centering the voices of those who have been historically marginalized in society, and yes, in our faith. 50 years ago, we listened to voices that had been silenced and marginalized. And as we look to the next 50 years, I believe that we are beginning to center and listen to another set of voices, challenging us to tear down cultures and structures of white privilege and white supremacy, so that together we can build a Unitarian Universalism of unconditional love and justice for all people. Now, before I say more about this movement and its connection to the revision of our principles and purposes, I want to take a few minutes to explore a little more of this vision of Unitarian Universalism that these new voices, these emerging voices, these essential voices are articulating, and what it means for the future of our faith. And the word that I believe truly captures this new way of understanding who we are and where we are going is solidarity. Now, one most often sees a word like solidarity in descriptions of social activism and social justice movements, maybe like the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and so on. When used in these contexts, solidarity is often understood as a shared commitment among people with very different backgrounds and experiences to a particular cause or goal, as well as a willingness on the part of those same people to be in relationship, to view and treat one another as equals, and at times to take risks and make sacrifices together. That kind of solidarity was certainly in evidence in Selma in the spring of 1965. Just to remind you of the events that went on, there was a brutal assault and murder of an unarmed African-American man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, by an Alabama state trooper. And that civil rights leaders launched protests in Selma to call attention not only to the police violence that took Jimmy Lee Jackson's life, but also to the blatant denial of voting rights experienced by African Americans both in Selma and all across the American South. As you may know or remember, the initial protests led to incredible acts of police violence on what came to be known as Bloody Sunday. In the aftermath of that violence, Dr. King and other civil rights leaders called on people of faith from across the country to come to Selma and join the protests. Now, the reading that Tori shared a few minutes ago is from a wonderful book by Mark Morrison Reed about the experiences of Unitarian Universalists who answered Dr. King's call. And as the book makes clear, Selma marked something new and I think never before experienced in our predominantly white, privileged faith tradition. Prior to Selma, we Unitarian Universalists had certainly proclaimed our commitment to civil rights and racial justice. But it was in Selma that for the very first time, I think, in our history, Unitarian Universalists not only supported a racial justice movement, but also journeyed side by side with people of color, taking risks and making sacrifices. Rather than remaining behind the safety of church walls or stained glass windows, Unitarian Universalists left their homes and churches, journeyed to a dangerous and unfamiliar place, built relationships of love and trust with people from different backgrounds and diverse experiences, and yes, risk their lives for something greater than themselves. And as some of you may know, two Unitarian Universalists, James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, did lose their lives in Selma. Why did they go? Why did those Unitarian Universalists drop everything and risk their lives by journeying to Selma? Listen to what James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo say. When asked why he was going to Selma, Reeb simply said, "It's a fight I believe in." Liuzzo, who had only become a UU just a few months before going to Selma, told her husband that she had to go because it's everybody's fight. There are too many people just standing around talking. Now, as Mark Morrison Reed makes clear, not only did the Unitarian Universalists in Selma help change the world, they themselves were forever changed. For the first time in many of their lives, these almost all white, almost all privileged Unitarian Universalists journeyed side by side with people of color, listening to and following African American leaders rather than being the ones in charge, and experiencing what it's like to be part of a movement in which the color of their skin did not automatically make them privileged or protected. And as Morrison Reed also points out, many white UUs who went to Selma looked back on that experience as the high point of their lives. For once, as he says, who they wanted to be and what they stood for as Unitarian Universalists were actually in harmony with how they were living and what they were doing with their lives. I would also add that what they found so lacking in many of their congregations was realized and experienced in Selma. No longer were they simply professing high-minded words or proclaiming their support for the struggle for justice. They were in that struggle. No longer were they seeing people of color as the other who needed to be rescued by the good white progressive people, but rather as leaders, as equals, and as friends. In my view, what Mark Morrison Reed describes as the spirit of Selma was an extraordinary moment, an extraordinary experience of true and genuine solidarity. Now, I wish I could finish this story by telling you that the solidarity so many experienced in Selma became the hallmark of Unitarian Universalism, and that that same spirit found its way back into our congregations. Sadly, that was not the case. Instead, a few short years after Selma, Unitarian Universalism found itself embroiled in what came to be known as the Black Empowerment Controversy. That controversy left many African American Unitarian Universalists wounded and feeling betrayed. I wish I had time to go into all the details of that. That'll probably be another sermon. But Mark Morrison Reed, this great historian, has written another book, and Sean will put that image up on the screen if you're interested in reading about what happened in that important and very unfortunate moment in our history. Let me simply say that we UUs unfortunately failed to build on the spirit of Selma and return to the comfort and familiarity of being a predominantly white privileged denomination that periodically offered those high-minded words, but did far too little to build the kind of relationships, to take the kind of risks, and to experience the kind of transformation that was experienced in Selma. Simply put, I think we missed a historic golden opportunity to become a religion of solidarity. And that is the way things remained in our denomination around issues of race and privilege, I'm sorry to say, for decades. But quite recently, maybe in the last decade or so, something has begun to stir in Unitarian Universalism, something that I can only describe as a movement of solidarity and transformation. And it is this movement that I hope and believe will come to define us in the 21st century. Now, it's important to note that the roots of this movement come from a place within our tradition that I hear echoes of that movement of UU women back in the 1970s and 80s who inspired our current 7 UU principles. Much like them, those women who demanded an end to patriarchy and equality between men and women, Unitarian Universalists of color and white allies have been courageously pointing to the structural, cultural, and institutional barriers that have kept Unitarian Universalism predominantly white, culturally Eurocentric, and that we have been unwilling to challenge and dismantle white privilege and white supremacy in our own tradition and in the wider world. As I said a few minutes ago, what those mostly white and privileged Unitarian Universalists experienced in Selma can be called solidarity because they followed rather than led. They listened more than they talked. And because they shared, if only for a brief time, in the experience, the struggle, and yes, I would even say in the suffering that those who have been historically relegated to the margins experienced every day. That raises an important question. So I can cite examples for you of what solidarity looks and feels like in the context of an individual social justice protest. But what does it look like in a religious denomination or in a religious community? What would it mean to live in solidarity not for a few days or even weeks, but every day, every week, every month, year after year? What would it mean for a religion or a religious community like the UU Congregation of Charlottesville to put solidarity at its center? Well, I think some of the most compelling and convincing answers to a question like this come from liberation theology, which demands that religion and religious communities embody something it calls a preferential option for those who have been and still are marginalized, silenced, and oppressed. As I understand it, this preferential option means putting the needs and the voices of those who have historically been ignored and excluded, put those voices in the center. For liberation theology, any religion that stays silent about the injustices of society rather than challenging them, and any religious community that does not decenter privilege, has put power and privilege at its center rather than love and justice. And putting love at the center of our faith is exactly what it means for Unitarian Universalism to become a religion of solidarity. And that, my friends, is what the proposed Article 2 revision of our principles and purposes does. Here is this wonderful diagram, I think many of you have seen it before, of the 7 values that the revised language lift up. Yeah, there it is. And as you can see, love is most assuredly in the center. Listen to this excerpt from the charge that our denomination's Board of Trustees gave the commission that's been working on this project for 2 years now. Here's what the board said. The board believes that one core theological value shared widely among Unitarian Universalists is love. The new principles and purposes should guide us in the transformation of ourselves, our communities, and our faith into active networks of collective care, restoration, and justice. They should be a living document that challenges Unitarian Universalists to place the liberation of all at the center of our lives. They should ask us to choose, listen to these three words, they should ask us to choose love in action. Where have we heard that before? As the path forward, and our commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism is most certainly love in action. We therefore charge this commission to root its work, our work, in love. And friends, I have to say that as I read this charge and the proposed new values that this commission has put together, I am so filled with hope for our future. I see a religion that is drawing on its universalist roots and centering itself in love, unity, friendship, and yes, solidarity. I see a religion, and yes, I see a congregation right here that is and will be working every day to throw open the doors of this sanctuary and this community to all people. I see a religion and a congregation that is willing to change, to learn, to listen, to grow, and yes, to be transformed by the beauty and the wisdom that lives in the pluralism and the diversity of the human family. And I see a religion and a congregation in which our shared mission and purpose leads us beyond these walls with courage, but also with humility, with commitment, and also with friendship. Let me simply conclude by inviting you to come back around 12:15-ish here in the sanctuary to continue the conversation. I would like to hear your thoughts, your questions, your dreams for the future of Unitarian Universalism and UU-CVille. These are exciting times in our faith and in this congregation. Having adopted a new mission last spring that calls us to build community through, yes, love in action, we are about to embark on a strategic planning process that I believe will enable us to live that mission and put that love into action. So let me close with these words, another quote from Mark Morrison Reed's book. He says, "It is not possible nor necessary to know the outcome of our actions. Therefore, we act in faith. Faith asks not that we succeed, but that we try. We try because we yearn to live out our values. Conscience urges us on, for we have dreamed of a better, more just tomorrow. We love, therefore we act. In acting, we risk having our hearts broken 1,000 times. Therefore, we are sustained by hope. That is the price those who cleared the way for us accepted. It is what living fully, deeply, and with integrity demands." Amen, and may it be so.